segundo, Cristina, pero vendrá más tarde. Okay, so acknowledgements. Hello. Excellent. So excellent speakers. So, good morning, everyone. Buenos días a todos y a todas por estar aquí. I would like to welcome all of you for attending this seminar, EU-US Relations in Perspective, Reflections on a Common Agenda. My name is Vicente Palacio, Foreign Policy Director of Fundación Alternativas, Alternatives Foundation. It's based, think tank based in Madrid. It's a top independent Spanish think tank. We produce annually dozens of reports on public policies and European Union studies for Spanish foreign policy. So we are very happy to be here. This is our first time we organize a seminar in the DC. And first of all, I would like to thank the Spanish Embassy in Washington and her ambassador, Ángeles Moreno-Bau, for her support, and also it's been incredible. And also from political counselor Antonio Royer, very especially, many thanks. Also to the EU delegation in the United States, here in Washington. And all of you for coming here, Spanish companies, people from the embassies, European embassies, thank you, experts, and general public for being here. Why are we here this morning in the DC? Why here and why now? This seminar for us intends to be a reflection on the current state of the transatlantic relations. In a critical moment of resetting the transatlantic agenda, our European and the US agenda. Some people might think that this is too early. Some people tell us, why don't we wait a little bit? It's not cherry blossom yet in Washington, D.C. So we said, okay, no. I think the opposite is true. We think that as trade and our business are at risk right now, as we Europeans are moving forward in the direction of more autonomy on the digital, on defense, as we are negotiating the terms of an end to the war in Ukraine, a lasting and just peace in Ukraine, as we are witnessing a moment of resetting NATO, our transatlantic alliance, the Atlantic Charter of 1941. This is a moment to reflect together and speak openly before it's too late, so that we can understand each other, speak to one another before it's too late. This is the way, this is why we have an excellent program this morning. We would like to share with you today with excellent speakers from Spain, from Europe, from the United States. Let me summarize briefly the program. We will open with the introduction from the ambassador of Spain, Ángeles Moreno-Bau. Then we hold a conversation with Ruth Vallada, the deputy head of the EU delegation here in Washington, as a warm-up. And we start with the first session. This focus on trade, on the green agenda, on investment, and industry, and economic security, which is one of the pillars of the new EU Commission. And second panel, starting at 12:15, I pray you to be punctual, all of you. We will be talking about the security on the current state of NATO, the transformations of the Atlantic Alliance, and of course the terms of peace on Ukraine. And finally, we have the closure by Deputy Head of the Spanish Embassy, Pablo Sanz. We encourage you to participate. Thank you very much for coming here. And I pray you again to be punctual, all of you, so that we can or have the schedule, everything as scheduled. And just remind you that this seminar will be recorded. So this is not off the record, okay? But you can speak freely. I hope you speak freely, and we have a great conversation today. So thank you very much, Ambassador Moreno. Thank you.
Thank you, Vicente. Thank you very much for your initiative, Vicente. We expected to organize this seminar 4 or 5 months ago, and we finally postponed it, and I think that it is very timely to host it now. Thank you, Fundación Alternativas, then, and thank you all for being here, attending this seminar, participating in it. It is a great honor to have such a wonderful panel of speakers today, also involved in the issues we will be dealing with, trade and security. The key liaison between Europe and the US in this transatlantic relation. This is the first seminar of Fundación Alternativas, and we hope we will be hosting many more, the first in a series. And as I said, it is dealing with 2 key questions of this transatlantic relation: the political, the security, and the economic relations between both the European Union and the United States are the closest and the strongest in the world. They have brought prosperity and security to millions of citizens on both sides of the Atlantic for many years, and together we have been navigating very different crises. Long-standing financial crisis and the COVID pandemic, or the Russian aggression against Ukraine, where we hope to find lasting and just peace. We believe the relationship is mutually beneficial, both from a commercial and trade point of view, and also from a security perspective. And I will first make some comments on the security relation. We are partners in NATO. We created NATO together. We have been defending common values and our way of life. We have been facing different challenges over the decades. We have been seeing NATO go up and down. At a certain point, there were comments, or it was decreed that it was in brain death, but it was renewed, and it emerged stronger. And this is why also we had new countries as members. Finland and Sweden choose to join. So before the real threat of war, we saw the organization grow, and its deterrence capabilities and defense capabilities increase. NATO has been ensuring peace and deterrence for Europeans. But we have been discussing also in the last years our own European capacity. And we have been launching our strategic compass in Europe, and we've been also trying to see how to rearm ourselves and how to reinforce the European pillar of NATO. Now, today, Why is it so important to discuss these issues? Because the administration of President Trump is questioning his priorities, and in the face of these, Europeans and Spaniards, obviously, and Europeans and other nationals have to interpret these new priorities and interpret them as a wake-up call, and thus reinforce our strategic autonomy. Many years we've been discussing open strategic autonomy. Maybe now we will concentrate more on strategic autonomy. The fact is we are ready to take our destiny into our own hands. Crises bring opportunities. We saw that in Europe during the COVID pandemic. We started purchasing medicines jointly. And this is an opportunity for Europe to grow up, and we are using it. And this will allow Europe to be stronger in political and in security terms. As I said, the European pillar of Europe within NATO has been in discussion for many years, and Europe definitely must have a strong defense posture within NATO. This is not something I say, this is something President Ursula von der Leyen has just said when promising that in 2030 we will be ready for it. European defense will lead to a new geometry in Europe. You know that Europe is very keen on considering different geometries for Schengen, for, well, the SECA at the beginning, for certain issues. So it depends on the items, it depends on the countries ready for it. We will not wait for all, we will also accept others. And we are seeing, for instance, that the UK, Norway, and Turkey are embracing also these new efforts we are doing in the industry of defense in defending this strong defense posture. But NATO and the EU are not at all rivals. We are complementary, and this is what we will be working on. This was already in the strategic compass, and it is repeatedly coming in the competitiveness compass that we just launched, and in all the regulations that Europe is launching on this. Europe has heard calls, obviously, for greater burden sharing. We've been compromising to those for many years. We may have been naive, but now we are responding and ensuring we carry out our weight as equal partners in NATO, both bilaterally and through the European institutions. We are now discussing how to achieve this, running budgets, numbers, and strategies. And we are determined to finance our security. And Spain is also determined to increasing our defense spending. The Prime Minister of Spain, Pedro Sánchez, has been outlining this approach. In 2024, we are now quantifying our defense spending using NATO metrics to establish a clear baseline. But we are determined, definitely, to get to the 2% we compromised as soon as possible. Just to remind many that in 2018, Spain had the lowest defense spending in its history at 0.9% of GDP. In 2023, our spending increased to 1.28%, rising in tandem with social investments. So the effort is being done. Fortunately, our GDP is growing at a high pace, 3%, which has also the consequence that in terms of defense spending, it always measures less, but the effort is clear, and it's today a work in progress. On trade now. Again, the transatlantic trade and investment relationship is a key pillar of the global economy, and no other economies are as integrated as ours, European and US economies. Entirely supply chains span the Atlantic. The US and the EU have the largest bilateral trade and investment relationship in the world, supporting over 16 million jobs and accounting for 42% of global GDP. In 2023 alone, bilateral trade flows reached 1.6 trillion euros. More than 4 billion euros worth of goods and services cross the Atlantic every day. European companies in the US employ 3.5 million Americans directly, and another 1 million American jobs depend directly on trade with Europe. Our bilateral investment flows are unparalleled, with more than 5 trillion euros invested in each other's economies. Notably, 2/3 of all US assets abroad are in Europe, and it's important to remind this data, to have really in mind how big and how intertwined our economies are. President Trump has expressed strong criticism of the European Union's trade policies, stating that Europe has treated the US unfairly. While we may not share this view, we must together work to ensure that both sides see their interests reflected in our relationship. Europeans will defend the integrity of our single market, one of the greatest achievements of European integration, while also seeking pragmatic solutions that reinforce our economic ties. Through dialogue, we believe dialogue is key. As European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen recently stated, the EU believes new tariffs by the US on steel and aluminium imports create uncertainty, disrupt supply chains, and threaten jobs. A comment on steel and aluminium. Steel is at the heart of the European Union creation. The SECA, the community for coal and steel, was the germ of the European Union. And we need steel, obviously, for our green transition, for the digital transition, and for the defense industry, to which we are definitely committed. So we are definitely going to defend our steel production. So while the European Union has responded with proportionate countermeasures, we remain open to dialogue, and we believe that burdening our economies with tariffs is not in our mutual interest. The European Union wants to engage, as I said, in meaningful dialogue and meaningful negotiations to find a better path forward, and Spain stands ready to help. These trade issues are absolutely communitized, and it is the European Union that leads the negotiations. At the same time, as emphasized by one of our distinguished participants today, who you will be listening to, Enrico Letta, we must fully unlock Europe's potential to generate wealth and jobs. Our newly approved competitiveness compass, to which I referred earlier, aims to achieve precisely that. You know very well we are very keen on regulations, on compasses, etc., but they produce results. And this competitiveness compass is a result of these reports by Draghi and by Letta, which pointed at the loopholes in our economy. So, and in our economic policies. So Europe has responded with this competitiveness compass that aims at investing more in innovation, in talent, cutting the red tape, and encouraging the green transition, the digital transition, the defense industry, and new funding tools. The green transition, because we are definitely committed to a green transition. For Spain, as always, and once again, Europe is the solution. We are one of the most Europeanized country. We believe very much in Europe, and the European barometers show every year that Spain is at the top of confidence in Europe. Ladies and gentlemen, let me conclude by stating that disagreement is not division, it is an invitation to dialogue. And dialogue, as is where we have always found our strength, as we just will see here today. Allies can disagree and still stand together. Our bond is strong, not because we always see the world in the same way, but because we share the same foundation, the same values. Looking ahead, we see a future where Europe and America build on what unites us, our love of freedom, peace, and our commitment to a world that is safer and more just. Our partnership will evolve, as it always has, through honest conversation and a shared resolve to face tomorrow together. So let us move forward together, not because we always agree, but because we are stronger together. Thank you very much, and I wish you a very fruitful discussion.
So, can you hear me? It's okay? Okay. So, again, so thank you very much, Ambassador. It's a great day today. This morning, we have today with us Ruth Vallada. She's deputy head of the EU delegation here in Washington, as I said before. And let me introduce very briefly. She has more than 23 years of experience in the European affairs. So you're the right person this morning. And to be here from 2020 to 2024, you were head of division of the US and Canada in the European External Service. So you were very well positioned to speak today on the transatlantic. You have that perspective as well. Also, you were political advisor for the Secretary General of the European External Action Service from 2019 to 2020. And you also hold a bachelor's degree in political science in the University of Malta, which we would like to visit very soon, as if possible, and a master's degree in economic studies from the College of Europe. This is a very important institution. So you have everything to speak. You have all to speak with us this morning and respond to very, very difficult questions. And we don't want to compromise. You bet. First of all, as Spanish ambassador said, it's very important not losing perspective and being fully aware of the data, which is very important, that all the things that we share between the Europeans and Americans. But from your perspective, from your personal and institutional perspective, tell us the truth. Do you think that Europe or the 27, are we more united now than we were before January 20, when the new administration took power in the United States? Are we more united now or are more divided?
Thanks a lot. Good morning, and buenos dias, and thank you for having me in such a wonderful place. I think the ambassador stole my thunder because she has given such an amazing speech and outlined pretty much where the EU-US relations are and the importance that it has for all our 27 member states, which brings me to the unity question. Look, I've been working for the EU for the last 23 years, and every, let's say, 2-3 years, the European Union is going to crash. We know it's going to end, and everybody's going to leave, and then suddenly, with every step, 2008 financial crisis, Brexit, COVID, and where we are, and every time we find this energy to get together and to pull out of crisis even more. And we have seen it also with the war in Ukraine. As you mentioned, I was working on transatlantic relations already then, and I remember being in meetings in preparation of the last, let's say, 10 days before the war. And I used to sit in meetings when we were discussing already with the United States, and my hierarchy used to reassure the Americans sitting and saying, if the Russians do this, you will see that Europe will react and will react immediately. And I used to sit on the chairs and I'm like, are we sure that this is, and sure enough, on the night when the tanks rolled in on Ukraine, you had unity, you had member states coming together, and you had a united response. And even today, 3 years later, yes, it takes a lot of discussion sometimes. It takes it takes discussions to keep this unity. But we stay together. We have the rollover of the sanctions. We have continued support to Ukraine that is quite consistent, and we have a project and a vision of where we would like to see Ukraine. So, are we more united than we were on 20th January? I think EU unity is something that we work on, and we work on every day, and we work on consistently. I think you will always have a core, you know, we are 27, we are different with different interests, but I think you will see that there will always be a big core of member states that will rally around and will you know, follow what the EU is doing, and then you will have member states that come in and coming eventually, or coming out of interest, or because they will get something else down the line, you know, in terms. So overall, I would say that we have EU unity, but it comes with a lot of work and discussions.
So it's a very positive message at these difficult times. So thank you. This morning we have two panels. One is on security and trade, industry, and second is on security, as you mentioned, war in Ukraine. But coming back to trade and technology, it's true that right now the US and Europe have different visions, and this link seems to be weakening a little bit. We're not converging on the dialogue. Take, for instance, the Transatlantic Trade and Technology Council, right? That you know well, it's not working now. So, is there anything that we can? Is there any message, positive message, that we can launch to our people, to the Europeans and Americans, in terms of how to guarantee our economic security vis-a-vis the United States? Is there anything that positive that can be said right now?
Look, I think, as the ambassador said, the positive story is in the numbers, and the numbers are real. This is a relationship of $1.7 trillion, 1.6 trillion euros of transatlantic trade between the two continents, and the number of people employed. The ambassador mentioned over 3.5 million directly employed, the others indirectly, investments, how much US companies sell in Europe and how much Europeans buy American products. So, you know, the numbers in themselves are the good story. And the reality is that European companies want to invest in the United States, come here to create jobs, good jobs that pay good salaries, stable salaries, and they are here to stay. They've been here for years and they are here to stay more. And similarly, American companies that might not like the way that we regulate, our market always, but are very much interested in selling services in the European Union market, because we are a solid market of high standards and high paying possibility of purchasing power. So the numbers in themselves say the story, the good story. And I think it's not only us as institutions or the governments of the member states, but you have a lot of businessmen, you have a lot of people that are interested in this relationship to go in the right way. So we will not be the only ones. There will be congressmen, governors, senators that will agree with us and want this European investment to stay in the US. Yes, we have diverging views with the current vision of how President Trump also portrays this relationship. President Trump prefers to speak only about goods when it comes to our trade relationship, forgetting that in terms of services, the Europeans buy much more. But okay, we understand this. I think there is readiness. The Commissioner Šefčovič has had a number of phone calls. He was here. We are listening. We are ready to make proposals. I think there is also unity amongst the member states, as we spoke, in the sense that this relationship needs to work. So I think there will be a lot of work together with the European Commission on taking this forward. And yes, we see, we see, as you mentioned, European security. For us, this is something that we see partnering the United States. So we would rather, in terms of growth, in terms of technology, in terms of biotech, in terms of quantum, that we work with allies and partners, and that we work with countries that are like-minded, which would include, of course, Canada, United Kingdom, and others that are ready to work with us. So this is where fundamentally we see our trade relationship, our security, economic security, energy security, very much linked with the United States, and then it is within the spirit that whilst there are divergences, that we can hope that we can have an open discussion and take this forward.
Just some minutes, 2 minutes before, and just Vasilis Kotoufaris from the EU delegation told us that a white paper was released yesterday. Can you speak a little bit about it?
It's actually just today, so there's the white paper on defense that came out today. It followed this morning. It follows up to the announcements that President von der Leyen has already done on Rearm Europe. I think, look, in terms of defense, and as the ambassador has mentioned earlier, there is a realization in Europe that that we need to do more. I think we can also say to President Trump that in 2016 he was right. We needed to spend more, and we needed to spend better. That's for sure. Certainly many would say we should have done it earlier. The reality is that I think we are very committed to do it now. You have seen over the last years a number of member states that have increased spending. The average spending in the EU is overall 2%. So when you calculate all the member states, you have some at much higher and closer even to the 5%. And as the ambassador mentioned, what the European Commission is doing now is strengthening the capacity of member states to spend more. So they're putting in EU money in this, but also supporting member states through their budgets and what the possibilities through their budgets can be done, so that more spending can be done and better spending can be done. And what the white paper says today is how we can take it forward to do it better. In terms of when we look at new procurement, in terms of strategic needs that we have. So in the possibility that, for instance, the United States would be focusing on other theaters and areas, there are a number of areas where the European member states rely on the United States. So we would need to see how to make sure that we have those capabilities to defend Europe and to be stronger and stronger players within NATO. As the ambassador said, there is neither appetite nor money to create a European army. This is not at all the vision. What the discussions are amongst the EU member states now is how to generate more money and more budget to be able to spend more in defense. And bracket here, defense spending in the EU overall, 63% of what the EU member states spend are spent in the United States. Our ideally is for us to do this also with the United States, and as we grow and as we strengthen the European industrial base. It doesn't mean that member states will be suddenly walking away and from the United States. A number of member states have defense programs that are there for the longer term, for 20, 30 years, and this will go on. So spending with the United States in terms of defense will inevitably maintain, but also we will also be looking at strengthening our industrial base in Europe, and doing so also by integrating, for instance, Ukraine, and by integrate. So this is one of the areas that will be very strong in that is very strong in the defense.
That's good.
That's
good news. That's good news that we Habemus paper, Habemus white paper. So now we have to implement the paper.
That's what the commissioner
we do
said.
have many papers. We produce many papers in Europe, many regulations and papers. That's good. And so we have to implement this. Things are moving very fast, and Europe cannot be left behind. Right? And we are in this race. Yesterday, President Trump and President Putin were speaking on Ukraine, the terms of a negotiation, and on Ukraine and on NATO, which are very linked dossiers. I have a question for you. Do you think that this going to be Ukraine might be a new fault line within Europe for the Europeans, for the 27, or do you think that this is the right moment for the European, so-called European pillar of within NATO, the European pillar of NATO, which would defend, including, by the way, to others like the UK, which is, by the way, in the map. You see, this is included in the blue, and in this map. It's not in the EU, but it's also a very important actor, and others to defend the Ukraine. What do you think is going to happen? Is more a new fault line or European pillar? The moment for a European pillar of NATO.
I don't have a crystal ball, but I'm a diplomat, so I will be positive. As I said, I think from our perspective, we have a vision for Ukraine, and as Ukraine as part of the European Union. As I mentioned in the white paper, you will also see that even in terms of defense and defense spending, we will want to integrate Ukraine with us. We want peace in Europe, and we know strongly that there's no one more than the Ukrainians that want to see peace. Our message has always and consistently been what kind of peace, and what kind of peace, and I think this will determine also what sort of new European security architecture will transpire after this. So what comes out of this conflict, and the most important is that you don't have a situation where there is an outcome that is only for 6 months or only for a year or for 3 years. We would rather see the end of this conflict to bring stability to the European continent. So I would rather not speak of fault lines, but I would rather say that our message has been consistent, and we're certainly working with the United Kingdom and others to make sure that we bring stability both back in Ukraine, but also in the whole continent. This also is out of interest to the United States. When it comes to investments, when it comes to business opportunities, nobody wants to go into an area where you have, where you don't know whether there's going to be war from one day to the other. So this is what we are all working towards. Let's see what this negotiation brings us to, but we're certainly very much working with, as I mentioned, with the UK, with all those that are working towards peace in Ukraine.
Thank you, Ruth. Well, we still have a few minutes time for questions and comments, and if anyone wants to add something or make some questions, and we still have 5 minutes. So this is an opportunity to ask Europeans and ours make some comments in the publication. I think we have a micro around. Yes. If anybody wants to intervene or ask. Maybe here, I don't know if, maybe here in the first row here. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you very much for the discussion. I was wondering whether you could touch upon tech policy and the prospects of the EU's approach to technology and innovation and cooperation with the United States. Thank you.
I mean, in terms of, we mentioned earlier that we had that the EU and the US have a trade and technology council. I'd like to make a remind that this trade and technology council actually started under the Trump 1 administration with at the time USTR Lighthizer. And then, by the time it got implemented, this was towards the end of the Trump administration, and then it started actually being implemented under the Biden administration. So, and there has been interest since from the Trump 1 administration to work on us, both on trade and technology issues. Of course, today there are a number of there are issues in the tech field. In particular, a number of member states question one of the last decisions by the Biden administration, where a number of member states were left out from the possibility of buying the very advanced or getting hold of the very advanced chips. So this would be something that we would be very much ready to work. Look, our premise of our economic security strategy is based on protect, promote, and the idea to work with and to work with partners. So there's always this opening for us to work with the United States on tech. And as I mentioned earlier, when it comes to chips, when it comes to biotech, when it comes to all areas that are under the tech policy that there's a lot of readiness to work with the United States. We have differences in the ways that we, of course, we regulate our single market, and we regulate how companies that are participate or benefiting from our market have to obey certain rules. However, of course, we do not impose those rules on the United States market themselves, but of course, companies follow those rules, and that's if they want to participate in the EU market. It is something that will come up with certainly with the Trump administration in negotiations. This will be part. These are EU rules. They have been established. The European Parliament values them, and so these are our rules as we see the way forward. So we're ready to enter into discussions. We're ready to explain. We have continuous dialogue with these companies. Our rules are also set in many ways that companies, countries lobby and put forward, have opportunities to shape with us the laws. There's huge lobbying and open conversations when we set up these rules. It's not like it's not like from one day to the next the EU regulates. So companies are very much informed. They know in advance. They know what's going to happen, there's also ample time for them to prepare if they want to benefit from being part and selling in the European market. But it is true that, of course, that we come with different philosophies. That said, I think there is a lot of understanding also from the private sector when it comes to AI, when it comes to development of AI, that they would rather have one set of rules for 27 than having 27 different rules in the EU alone, which is also a bit what is happening in the United States when you see certain states coming up with their own regulations in the tech field.
Thank you very much, Ruth, Deputy Head of the EU delegation in Washington. You provide us with a very good basis for further discussion this morning. So we are moving forward to the first session on economy. Thank you very much for giving us your perspective. Yep.
Thank you. We move now to the first panel of this morning, Trade, Industrial Policy, and the Green Deal in the US and Europe. Please.
Thank you. Is this working? Can you? Yeah, I think you can hear me. All right. Well, good morning. Buenos dias. Thank you very much for having me here. My name is Stephanie. I'm actually neither Spanish nor American, but German. And I'm the Washington correspondent for Die Welt. I spent a lot of my life in Spain, so I love this country. I speak the language as well. And I was also a Brussels correspondent quite a while ago. So yeah, that goes very much also to my heart, what's going on between Washington and Brussels and the member countries. Let me first briefly introduce the panel. I, of course, start with you, Tracy. Tracy McKibben, she's the founder and CEO of the New York-based MAC, or MAC, how do you say? MAC. Global Partners. She's an expert in global business development, in international finance and economic policy, and I hope to hear from you what the real impact of what we're talking about is on the ground. Then to my right is Federico Steinberg. He's an economist and the chair of the Príncipe de Asturias in Georgetown University, so based here in Washington as well, and an expert on international trade, economic development, globalization, and most importantly, European Union policies. And last but not least, but he's going, I understand, to be over video, there he is, hello, is Ignacio García Bercero. He's a non-resident fellow at Bruegel. And in this context, if I may say more importantly, he was a former director at the Directorate for Trade at the European Commission between 2001 and 2019, so he has experience with a Trump presidency and what it means for trade. So this is going to be very interesting. But we will first start with a video, a so-called special intervention by Enrico Letta, the former Italian Prime Minister, and the author of the report, Much More Than a Market. And we're going to first watch this video, and then we're going into the discussion. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I'm very sorry because I'm not able to attend physically this event. It would have been great for me to be with you today, first of all, to listen, to understand, to try to perceive what is the mood, what are the ideas, what are the reflections. We are in a time in which, in reality, we are all trying to understand better. The old compass is no more there. This is what we are all aware. The old compass is no more there, and the need to organize new compass and to organize, first of all, a new vocabulary. I'll try to give you some ideas on how I'm trying to organize a new compass, or my new compass. First point about Europe, the role of Europe, the future of Europe. In the report I wrote last year on the future of the European single market, report that I presented in two interesting conversations in Washington, D.C., one at Georgetown University, another one at the American Chamber of Commerce. I had the opportunity to elaborate some messages, for me important, on how the European Union has to integrate the single market, how to complete the integration of the single market, and how this integration of the single market can be interesting also for the relationship with the US. In reality, on some issues, I also took lessons from the history of the US integration, economic integration. All this, for instance, story of the role of Delaware as a strong integrating tool on corporate laws, on corporate side in the US, and the fact that in Europe we have 27 corporate laws, and in some countries we have regional corporate laws, and the need to be more integrated. But what I would like to share with you is the idea that in reality the integration of the single market, of the European single market, is something that can find a fantastic boost from outside, a fantastic federator from outside with the present American administration. I say that because in the past, in reality, we were a little bit lazy as Europeans, considering that the big effort in achieving successfully the monetary unification was too big, too complex, with an enormous effort, and then we decided not to do the same on the economic union. And this is the reason why we have three main sectors that are telecom, energy, and first of all financial services, where the single market is not integrated, and the lack of integration is today one of the reasons of the losing competitiveness of the European Union. Because in reality, the fact that we have the same currency and we don't have a single financial market is the demonstration of a very schizophrenic approach on the relationship between single market and national dimension. And the same for telecom, the same for energy. Of course, the same also on the defense side, even if the defense side is not the same, because defense is not a single market by definition. But at the same time, this fragmentation is today for us one of the main problems. This is why the report is trying to propose a relaunch of the integration of the single market. And what is happening in the relationship with the US can be today a very important boost to convince European leaders to move. First of all, to move on the integration of financial markets. The fact to have a strong integrated financial market means for the European Union the way to find money, resources, common investments for the public goods, for the European public goods. I think what von der Leyen proposed to the European Council and the European Council accepted even on defense is a very good first step, because the link between the creation of the Savings and Investments Union, that is the new name I proposed for the old Capital Markets Union, this proposal is part of my report. I have to say maybe it's the core of my report, the creation of a Savings and Investments Union, the way to create an integrated market of savings and to bridge and to link these savings to investments. That is the way to invest in public goods, where today finding national money is more and more complicated. I mean, for instance, accompanying the Green Deal and fighting against climate change. I mean, of course, defense issues, infrastructures, and many other topics where the need to have common money is absolutely fundamental at European level. And this effort today is an effort where the big challenge that we are, I would say, perceiving from the US side, from the new administration, is a challenge that can, I would say, give the European leaders the idea that there's no other option than being integrated. I guess that what happened in the last months is something that I think never happened in the past. This acceleration was a good signal, and I think it is the best signal in the relationship of what we can do with the US. I say that also for a second point that I would like to underline this conversation, that is the fact that I don't think that the European Union and the US have to consider that their, I would say, structural alliance is in structural danger. I think we are living in turbulent times, and challenges that the present Trump 2 administration are launching to the European Union are existential challenges and very complex issues. But at the same time, I know very well that the close tie between Europe and the US, the transatlantic tie, is something that is more important than governments. It's something that is crucial for people, is crucial for entrepreneurs, for economic milieu, for cultures, for families, for students, for universities. We are in a same transatlantic milieu, in a same transatlantic environment. My strong, I would say, purpose is to find a way to preserve these ties and to make these ties able to survive what is happening at government level. I know very well that governments are changing, and government change very often in both sides of the Atlantic. And I know very well that our relationship has to survive to the changes of government. This is why I think we have to create a sort of coalition of the willing people with the goodwill to preserve the relationship between the US and Europe, knowing that this relationship is more important than ever, is more important than all the differences that we can find on single issues. And I say that to the Europeans, even if today we are angry because we feel that the US aggression to the European Union, Trump's word on considering the European Union as a threat for the US, as an existential threat because the European Union is a multilateral institution, the European Union is a multinational framework. I think we have to be very, I would say, wise in considering that the survival of our relationship is more important than the persons that are today leading our countries. So this coalition of the willing, this people of goodwill, is today a fundamental track for all of us. This is why I want to conclude this conversation and these thoughts by saying that all the boost, all the ideas to have a more integrated Europe that I put in the report on the future of the single market are valuable, are good, are important with Trump or with another president of the US. Trump's presence is accelerating the need to have this mission satisfied and these purposes. But I wrote the report before Trump's arrival. These needs to have a more integrated Europe are fundamental. And I want to tell you that in my report, written last year, I decided to put also a proposal that today seems a little bit, I would say, out of the blue. And this proposal is to create a transatlantic single market. Maybe it is not now, maybe it is not for tomorrow, but in the future we have to consider that the creation of a transatlantic single market among the two biggest Western powers will be a big mission for all of us, and we have to work in that direction. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you to Enrico Letta for this introduction to kick us off. It's very important to me that we open the floor very soon, so we probably gonna talk a little bit, like 15, 20 minutes, and then I want to make this an exchange and lively, so please think of questions, and I'll take as many questions as I can. But I would like, as I have the privilege as a journalist, to ask the first questions. And I would like to start with you, Federico. And forgive me, I will ask you an everyday question, and I'm happy for you to do your remarks, but I'm not an economist. I'm just a normal person living in Washington. And of course, I like Rioja very much. So I was intrigued by a story this morning in Axios, and we're talking about trade and tit for tat and trade wars and tariffs coming in, that there was a sale at Logan Circle this weekend where a wine shop was selling off their wines for 10 to 15% reduction in order to get money and to then buy bulk because they try to prepare for whatever might happen. So as a Washingtonian, for a normal person, what are we looking at right now? What effect, what do you expect to happen? How will we be affected by what's going on between Trump and the European Commission?
Yes, thank you. Well, and thank you for the organization of the event. Well, the simple question is you're going to drink much more Californian wine. So, I mean, and this is tragic because, you know, trade is supposed to be good for consumers who can have cheaper and more diverse options. And tariffs are bad for consumers and they're bad for the overall transatlantic economy. Enrico Letta has been talking about this transatlantic economic space, which I know is his deep desire, but to be honest, I think this is much more unlikely now than when he finished the report under the Biden administration. And just a couple of comments before, and now I get more into the trade issue. I understand the European Union has to do whatever possible to have a fruitful relationship with the Trump administration, to avoid a trade war, to avoid a tech war, to avoid tech war in regulation, basically on taxation of corporations and problems with because of misinformation, to try to find a common ground on energy and climate, which is going to be very difficult. You'll talk about this more probably. But at the end of the day, I think the European Union has to realize that there's a structural change. And it's not only the Trump administration. Perhaps the European Union is better prepared now for Trump than with Trump 1, because it has some experience, and Ignacio will probably touch on that very much. But the truth is that Europe at this point is in a weaker position. The transatlantic relation is more unbalanced. The US is richer, is more dynamic, has higher productivity, and it has the security umbrella, which we are going to be trying to substitute, but it's going to be different. But the bottom line is that even with the Biden administration, the US took an approach which I would call, the US did what it wanted, then the Europeans complained. This goes for the IRA subsidies, this goes for a number of events, the economic security strategy, semiconductors and export controls to China. And then the Europeans complained and the Americans apologized and said, I'm sorry, I didn't intend to do any damage to Europe, but I'm going to do what I have to do. And if it goes being WTO incompatible, I don't care, et cetera, et cetera. So that was with Biden. So with Trump, it's going to be much worse. Probably we're going to be looking at a situation in which the anti-coercion instrument, which was designed for responding to countries that exercise coercion to the European Union, could be used. And it's really impressive that we're saying that the US could exert coercion, economic coercion, to the Europeans, because that would mean that what used to be an ally might be a threat or even a worse word that I won't use. You can put the next one you want to keep the diplomatic, fruitful discussion. But if we look at what, the view of Trump of the world, the goals of the tariffs that we can discuss in more detail, I think that there's a fundamental structural change that compared to the last crisis of 2003 with the Iraq war is going to be much more relevant. So the Europeans have to be ready to respond, and we can get into how exactly.
Yeah, if I could actually just pick that up and then turn the floor to, if I may, first to Ignacio. If you compare, because if I understand, you witnessed firsthand the first Trump presidency and the effect on trade. And this time around, the European Commission was much better prepared, tougher. Do you think that it will bring a better relation or not a better result at the end of the day?
Hello. Let me perhaps start by questioning a little bit this premise that we were not prepared in the first Trump administration. What is different is that the conflict that we had during the first Trump administration was much more self-contained. We had to face a protectionist action on steel and aluminium. The steel sector has been subject to protectionist measures for a long time, so it was nothing terribly new. There was a very clear and firm reaction from the European Union to the tariffs on steel and aluminium. And after discussions in the White House between President Trump and President Juncker, both sides agreed that it made no sense to open up a major trade conflict between the United States and the EU, that the main challenges that we were both facing was China. We started to cooperate much more closely with the United States and also with Japan on how to respond to non-market economic practices in China. And we managed to continue our trade relationship without major additional turbulence. So what we are facing now, I think, is a much, much bigger threat. The first action has been on steel and aluminium, where the United States has eliminated the flexibility that have been introduced in the past, including by the Trump administration itself, and has adopted much more restrictive measures on steel and aluminium. The European Union has reacted in the same manner that it reacted in the first Trump administration, although because the measures are more significant this time, the retaliation is bigger. But the real test is going to be what happens the 2nd of April. because there we may be facing something for which there is no precedent. The United States has been threatening the application of 25% tariffs across the board, potentially to all exports of the European Union to the United States. The argument for this is lack of reciprocity, but if you go a little bit deeper to try to understand what is behind this argument, you realize that in reality, this is a trade conflict which is totally artificial. I mean, most of the 25% tariff is actually value-added tax. 170 countries in the world apply a value-added tax. It's a non-discriminatory domestic tax, which applies in the same manner to domestic products and to imported products. So pretending that this is a trade obstacle that needs to be tarified is a totally arbitrary action. We will need to see what happens the 2nd of April. I still hope that the reason will prevail and that we will not be facing immediate tariff action, but much more a period where both sides can discuss and try to find a way to solve the issues through dialogue. But at this point in time, I have to say the type of threat that we are facing at this stage is a very, very fundamental threat, which is really putting in question the very basis of the transatlantic trade partnership. And I really hope that it will not come to that, and it will be possible to try to steer our relationship in a more cooperative direction. We both are facing challenges relating to non-market economic practices on China. The European Union is becoming much tougher on China. I mean, this week, the European Commission, I believe, will announce a steel action plan. This steel action plan will make clear that the European Union will need to maintain tariff protection of the steel sector after the expiry of the safeguard measure, which is currently being applied. It will also make clear that we intend to toughen our trade defense instruments, introducing much tougher rules of origin in a direction, by the way, that the United States have been asking the European Union to take. So it's really very, very unfortunate that at the moment where it should be possible for both sides to continue to cooperate, that we may be facing extremely damaging bilateral trade conflict from which no one would win. But of course, if we are facing a totally arbitrary tariff on all our exports to the European Union will react. I don't think it has any other option but to react.
Thank you. Tracy, if I may turn to you, because you see this from a business perspective. Yeah. If you were in the room with the trade representatives of the US and the EU, and you could tell them, do this or don't do this, what arguments would you give them?
Couple of thoughts, and I come from the background, I have served in government. I served in the George W. Bush administration where I covered EU relations and European economic issues. Today I am on the business side. We invest in the renewable energy space. We call it the environmental ecosystem. So I would start out by a couple points that I want to say at the outset, and I like the perspective of the understanding the paper that's recently come out and the experience based off of the first Trump administration. There is a saying that we say in the investment world that several of you will know, that, which is that past performance is never an indication of future performance. So the playbook, I think, is completely changed. That being said, I'm by nature an optimistic person. I do like the fact that the headline is about a common agenda. And I do think we are going through a reset. And to figure out how best do we do this that we lead to, sort of mutual economic growth and benefit as opposed to mutual pain. From the business side, as I try to look at this, I think it is a transatlantic shared view of what's behind, trying to understand what's behind all of this. And so while this discussion for this panel is about trade, and I think the next panel is about NATO and security, I think they are very much related. It really is about security, whether you call it economic security, energy security, or national security. And so when I think about the implications for the ability for trade to continue to flow, for commercial relationships to be supported, what I would say is, the underlying, what you're trying to do is make sure that you've got an equal playing field. Both the US and Europe share core fundamental desires, which is to create good manufacturing jobs, to support businesses, to help them grow and expand both domestically and internationally, despite the view that Some might think that you can all just sell internally. I'm a big believer in international growth, as well as looking for ways that you can finance the growth of your corporations through innovation, in addition to making energy more affordable, as well as building out and growing your economy. And I think that's shared on both sides of the Atlantic. And so if you take that perspective, how do you reach a point where you feel like everyone, it's an even playing field, we're all playing with our strengths and benefits, and ultimately we share, again, the common agenda, I continue to go back to that, because we share common values. We share a common belief about the respect for contracts and about the rule of law, fundamentally. And a trade war between economies that are so intertwined really only benefits one other country, and that's China. Because what we ultimately end up doing is impacting pricing. And so from a business perspective, with the tariffs on both sides, what you're doing is you're increasing the prices that consumers will be paying, and that does not benefit either side of the Atlantic. And so, and businesses obviously want certainty. I remember being in government, and one of the things that we would always say is that what you wanted is to create a stable environment where businesses knew what they were investing in and what the results and returns would be for those investments. And so, and I do think there is a shared belief on both sides that that is ultimately what we want. There is a difference in how do you go about getting that when you have the perspective that some may say that the game has been unfair and we haven't benefited, and others will say that's, we've played the game as it has been laid out to us. I think what will be required, my own personal view, is to have a sort of a reimagining of what the WTO is all about, because these disputes fundamentally were supposed to be handled by the WTO. That obviously hasn't happened for a number of reasons, and so as you have this reset from a business perspective, what I think many would like to see is, again, an understanding of what the environment is, and having an environment that encourages more investment rather than questions about, if I make an investment today, will things change tomorrow? And so having that consistency for a longer term. I mean, when you think about, I'll just stop there. So that's sort of how I would bring the sort of the perspective of how I operate today from a business perspective, but also connecting it to having worked in policy and developed policy as well.
Yeah, can I just briefly follow up on this? Because again, I try to make this more comprehensible for what does it mean? It's early days, right? It's 20th of January, it's not so long ago, but it feels like a long time for many reasons. But in the Biden presidency, it was interesting to see that, I can only speak for the German economy, but there were big German companies now investing in the US because of the IRA. Now Trump says this is exactly what he wants. He wants actually non-US companies to come here, avoid tariffs, and open their plants here. Is that realistic?
Is it realistic for companies to come here and open plants? Absolutely. I mean, that's what's happened. To your point about German manufacturers coming in, it was based off of both the IRA as well as the infrastructure bill, the bipartisan infrastructure bill, where you had a number of foreign companies, certainly a number of European companies, developing manufacturing facilities in the US, both because of the federal incentives that were created, but also states have incentives that have encouraged that kind of investment. So I do think it is realistic that you would want to encourage, and I think ultimately even this administration, though I don't speak for it or have a desire to speak for it, this administration wants to see that increased investment in the US. The way you go about doing that, again, I think, is to create an environment where people understand what the expectations are, have certainty around support, what from a policy perspective, what the policy and regulatory framework will be, reducing barriers to that ability to invest, both from sort of bureaucracy, red tape, as well as barriers around financing and how do you bring that investment in. So I do think it is realistic and possible to do that. And I will say, even in the Biden administration, we can't forget they also implemented tariffs. There were tariffs, when battery technology, solar cells, EVs, and so tariffs can be used in a way to sort of reset the economic framework. But it has to be done, again, in a way that respects the nature of the relationship of those on the receiving end. And ultimately, I think it's the ambassador highlighted in her comments, what you want is to bring people to the table and continue to have a dialogue about how to do that, because we do have shared and common values and common interests about creating these kinds of jobs, supporting our economies, creating and supporting energy security, economic security, as well as national security.
Federico, we are coming, yeah.
But my impression is that basically, and you put it very well, if business wants certainty, and I think the slowdown of the American economy has quite a lot to do with the increase in certainty, this is precisely the opposite of what it's needed. And then if you start seeing, that this belief in the rule of law is there, but then you have the administration pointing at particular judges or people nominated to the military or independent agencies, or opening up executive orders in which the desire of the administration seems to be to completely undermine the rule of law. I don't think this is very trustable for people thinking about investing. And then to your point, if we're talking about the West versus China, I would completely agree, even though we can discuss on the details. But what the Trump tariffs are going to do, because on the first Trump administration and the Biden administration, the tariffs were not towards allies. And then it's also interesting that you mentioned the WTO, but in fact, there's been complete neglect of the rules-based system by the United States, and that's a fact. It's not going to be changed. So even without getting into the logic of the rationale of tariffs, reducing the bilateral trade deficit, any Econ 101 student knows that this makes no economic sense. Secondly, most of the evidence points out to the fact that you're not going to create manufacturing jobs in the rich countries. You're going to, if you're reshore, it's going to be automation, it's going to be AI, it's not going to be jobs. So that also, all the evidence points to the direction that the industrialized countries are deindustrializing because the world economy for rich countries in the 21st century is about services. And services and tariffs have nothing to do one with the other. Tariffs are for goods, and the majority of the modern value-added creation is on services. So that goes to a vision by the Trump administration of trade relations that has to be with the 19th century, or even the 20th century if you want, not the 21st century. From the European perspective, what you probably see, and Ignacio is sitting in Brussels, is that the playbook is not clear. Maybe the only playbook is to force others to appreciate their currency vis-a-vis the dollar, the so-called Mar-a-Lago agreement. If you are threatening countries, maybe you can do it with Canada and Mexico. Maybe you can do it with Japan, because the security umbrella, the US security umbrella to Japan is not under question, and China is very close to Japan. But you're not going to convince the Chinese or the Europeans or the hedge funds to change their portfolios to make sure the dollar is going to depreciate, so you're going to have more exports. And also, the trade today is through value-added chains. It's not about, I do my good here 100% and I export it. So the tariff is going to kill parts of the production process. So the problem, I think, from the European perspective is just being puzzled and saying, and then, as Ignacio mentioned, and you think VAT is a tariff, which it's not, because it's non-discriminatory. So I would be all for sitting and discussing, but when one side is, I guess, convinced of some argument that are quite irrational from a traditional economics perspective, I think it's going to be very difficult.
Yeah, Ignacio, if I could turn back to you, since you are in Brussels and you have a much better insight and you are on the spot where things are happening, what do you think is going to be the playbook? What are the Europeans going to do? Is it continuing to be a tit for tat, or what are we looking at?
Perfectly fine. I'm in Brussels, but I'm no longer in government, so I have no particular insights in terms of what Brussels intends to do. But I think the big problem that we are facing here is the total lack of clarity about what are the objectives that the US administration is actually following. Now, the complaint is about the trade deficit, but any economist would tell you that it's totally arbitrary to base an argument on the fact that there's a deficit in trading goods without looking into investment flows, without looking into services. And in any case, if the issue was the need for a better adjustment of the European economy. What is happening now in Europe goes very much in the direction of what the United States could expect. There have been historical decisions that have been taken in Germany in terms of more deficit financing. Hopefully this will also be followed up by action at the European level. All member states of the European Union are very much recognizing that Europe needs to be much more responsible for its own defense. It needs to spend more money in defense. So if that's what the United States is concerned about, the direction in which things are moving in Europe is the one that one would expect the United States to work on. But instead of that, we are facing a totally artificial trade conflict, and we really do not know what it is that the United States wants to achieve. I mean, if you are going to be applying a 25% tariff because of VAT, what it is that you can actually negotiate about. There's no way that you are going to have a negotiation about taxes in the European Union. That it's totally impossible to imagine that you have a serious conversation about that. So there's a little bit of a suspicion or a perception that at the end of the day, this reciprocity argument is an excuse, and that in reality, this administration seems to have come to the view that it wants to protect its manufacturing sector. Very questionable that this is actually going to be very effective, because at the end of the day, if you apply high tariffs across the board to all manufacturing products, you are not going to have a competitive manufacturing sector. So that's not going to be very economically wise either. And that there is also looking into tariffs as a source of revenue. And that is the objective that the administration is pursuing. It's very difficult to see what it is that can be negotiated in good faith. Now, this being said, I'm sure that there will be a strong preference by European policymakers to try to avoid a tit-for-tat escalation. Let's hope that there is not an announcement the 2nd of April that tariffs are going to be applied immediately or very rapidly. Let's hope that there's going to be a space for having meaningful conversations, because I think that hopefully through those conversations it will be possible to identify that there is more common interest that would justify avoiding what would be a totally artificial trade conflict. I mean, no one is going to be able to explain in Europe that the United States has decided now to begin the big trade conflict with the European Union because it considers that VAT is an unfair tax.
So can I just
Yeah,
just
of course.
a comment? Because I'm the last person to try to defend or explain the current administration, not in government. But I will say, in terms of, it is still early. We're less than 100 days in, and it has been confusing and painful to some. But I do, in response to the comment you made about, because I do think we do share common values. We share respect for an understanding of the importance of rule of law and sanctity of contract. And so the administration is one branch of government. And so again, it's still early. The rule of law, the case has not been proven that the rule of law does not work here in the US. I started this by saying I'm an optimist by nature. We have a judicial system. And so we have laws that need to be respected, and we have, independent branches of government that will ultimately have an opinion about this. So I wanted to, I thought it was important to state that point. And I say it because, again, as I said, an understanding what the expectations are, what can be expected. I do expect there to be a response and a reaction to the ultimate impact of this, both on consumers as well as on businesses, because I do think that the administration does care about what that means. And I don't think it will take long for the impact to be, I think it's already being seen, for that impact to be seen. And I do think there will be a response, a more appropriate response to what that means. There is the desired goal, I think, behind, again, I'm not an interpreter or translator of that, behind what this ultimately was trying to achieve, which is, again, energy security, economic security, national security. How it's ultimately been delivered is questionable. But even with that understanding that ultimately what they don't want to do is hurt US consumers. And because this relationship is so intertwined, I do think that you will see ultimately, or I should say, I hope that calmer minds will prevail in that this is not the way to pursue the ultimate outcome you want, which is to have a more even playing field. So.
But I think unavoidably you can see developments like, I think the Financial Times ran the story this morning that the 150 billion budget by the Commission for Defense will exclusively go to arms companies in the European Union. So not even the UK, not the US, not Turkey. So to the two Europeans here on the panel, do you see, because, and as Tracy rightly said, it's only very short time, but there is a mind shift going on in Europe, a more protectionist, I mean, we have to, of course, because of defense, but is this also now, has this repercussions on the whole spectrum of economy, society?
I don't think so. I think that the Buy European clause on the defense sector is a very French prerogative. I would say that it's a mistake. You should include the UK. I don't know about the US, to be honest. But overall, what you see is that the trade strategy of the European Commission has been to try to open up new markets. The Mercosur agreement, Ursula von der Leyen was in India to try to accelerate the negotiation on an FTA. And more engaging, and also even trying to stay within the WTO framework when possible, and to work with like-minded countries for that objective. And this also can extend to a conversation that's going on in Washington these days about what does the US think about membership of the World Bank and the Inter-American Development Bank and the IMF. That's an open conversation. We'll see it unfold, particularly World Bank and Inter-American and other regional banks, but there the Europeans will step up for those values of cooperation and multilateralism. But one thing that we're going to see probably is that the European Union has to think, differently about its economic and trade relationship with China. And this is the US pushing the European Union towards China. Let's be clear. It's not, it didn't have to happen. It's a result of the actions from Washington, I think. Mm-hmm.
Ignacio, do you see that differently or similarly?
That's basically one or two nuances. By the way, I agree with Federico that I don't think it was a good idea not to include the UK in this funding for defense. My understanding is that this Buy European clause can be derogated to security agreements that can be negotiated with certain countries. On China is where I would like to introduce a nuance. It is certainly true that the more that we are facing aggressive trade action from the United States, the more that it might be inevitable to see to what extent we can try to improve our trade and investment relationship with China. But at the same time, I would say that there are very deep concerns about lack of reciprocity in access to the Chinese market, about excess capacity which are disturbing the global markets. These problems are not becoming any simpler. Actually, they may even become worse, because the more that the US also increases its tariffs upon China, the more that Chinese products may be diverted into the European Union market. So I think that inevitably the relationship between the European Union and China, even if the US decides to open up a trade conflict with the EU, is not going to be so simple as that. I think there's going to continue to be tensions, which makes it even more important to look into the rest of the world, to look into Latin America, to look into the Indo-Pacific, to try to conclude more trade agreements, to try to work with those countries that still believe in the WTO framework, to see how the WTO can be improved in its functioning, and also to go back to the initial intervention by Enrico Letta, to strengthen the single market, to move in the direction of savings and capital union. I mean, if there is some imbalances in the bilateral current account between the United States and the European Union, it's because too much European savings goes to the United States. If there was going to be more opportunities for investment in the European Union, there you would actually have a more balanced current account. So I think, in my view, this is the opportunity to try to do certain things to make the European Union economy more competitive, that have been done before, and that faced with the situation where, unfortunately, it appears that there's going to be a rather turbulent trade relationship with the United States. This is an occasion to also strengthen the European economy and strengthen our partnership with as many countries as possible.
Well, that was a lot of food for thought. So I'm sorry, it's only 12 minutes left, but I'd very much like to open the panel to questions. If you would say your name briefly and ask your questions. Oh, yeah, there's a micro coming. Yeah, the lady here with the white jacket.
For Strategic and International Studies. 2 months into President Trump's second term, we've seen Trump going back and forth with tariffs against Mexico and Canada, America's closest trading partners, as well as causing strain on transatlantic relations with its European partners. On the other hand, we have Canada's new leader, Mark Carney, choosing Europe over Washington for his first official visit as Prime Minister. Do you foresee an opportunity for the European Union to diversify its trade and strengthen its trade ties with Canada, for example? And if so, in which areas? Thank you so much.
Yes,
Federico?
Just briefly. No, I think there's an opportunity. I mean, Canada and the EU have the CETA, the Comprehensive Agreement on Trade, but this has some years now. I think there's an opportunity to try to go deeper and do with Canada what the European Union has with Turkey, which is it's a custom union, there's some elements on agriculture there, but basically that could be part of the overall discussion about, I mean, if Canada were in Europe, I'm sure Canada would be a member of the EU, but that's another conversation.
Do we have any other questions from the audience? Yeah, in front.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the discussion. It's related to the question that was just asked. I'd like to know if you believe that some experts are saying that the European Union should follow a full-on strategy of de-risking from the United States. Do you believe this is desirable? Do you believe this is feasible? How long would this take? And who could replace the United States in some of these markets? Thank you.
Tracy, I think that's for you.
So I would like to discourage very strongly any further separation between in trade relations between the U.S. and the EU or the transatlantic. For obvious reasons, is because we do, as I have repeated, we do share fundamental common basic values. The relationships are so intertwined. I'm on the board of companies that are global. I mean, and operate both, in the U.S. as well as in Europe. And so I think that, and I heard your comment earlier about like maybe perhaps this might be or maybe it was the other panelists, a move closer toward China. I don't expect that the result to be any more fair with Europe than it was with the US in a relationship with China. And so how do we take advantage of those clear connections that we have where companies, it is an easier place to expand as US companies are looking to expand globally. Europe is an obvious location, and I imagine it's the same thing with European companies as they look to expand globally. The US is an obvious market for the reasons that I've already shared. So that would be my quick answer to it.
Probably. I have something to say, but Ignacio maybe has something.
Yeah. Would you like to comment?
And if you actually look into the areas where the European Union is highly dependent on the United States, there is first and foremost defense. There is also digital platforms, and there is the financial system. These are the main three areas where the European Union is highly dependent on the United States. Dependencies with China of a very different nature. It is clear that the interest will be to keep as close as possible to trade and investment relationship with the United States. European companies have invested a lot in the US market, and US companies have invested a lot in the European market. So disrupting their value chains would be very, very, very costly. And I think, therefore, the one hope that wisdom will prevail, and that therefore there would not be a need to think about broader de-risking. This being said, it is clear that on certain areas like defense, the European need to be much more responsible for their own defense. They need to develop their capabilities, and that would imply more autonomy in relation to the United States.
Just a comment on that. Basically, I think you have to distinguish. So the paradox is that you do de-risking, you don't do decoupling. I think nobody's talking about decoupling. So cross-trade and investment in areas which are not essential for national security or for economic security are out of the question. And that's why I would agree with you that the economic infrastructure between the US and the EU is very deep, and that would not be structurally changed. The problem is that you are going to include more elements, and as Ignacio was saying, security. For example, the European countries are starting to stop buying the F-35s from the US. Why? Because if you need replacements, perhaps one day the US will not sell to you. And this is unthinkable, but is what we have in the table. So the EU would have to, when it develops its economic security strategy, and the risking is the key component there, there are elements in which, the same as with China or with Russia, there would be elements in which you don't want to be so dependent on the US. And this is bad for both, because it puts problem on achieving economies of scale and having this eternal 80-year trust across the Atlantic.
Mm-hmm. And I'll just add one final comment on that is, de-risking may be the wrong word, certainly not decoupling, but, and this may be a bad word in the current environment, but diversification is always good. So.
If there is no more other question, I have one more, because actually it's in the title of our panel, and we haven't talked about it at all, which is the Green Deal, which the current US president calls the green scum. We had the IRA, it was top agenda, very attractive to invest in the US for European companies, because also they have the knowledge and experience, and it's a big fight against climate change was a big thing in the EU, has also now been rolled back a little bit. But what are the consequences actually now for investors and in this segment? Do you already see de-investment, less investment?
So there is, in my world, we see a slowdown in the ability to get financing, but there are several layers to that. So I will start to say, it wasn't the investments of European companies into the US wasn't just from the IRA. We forget about the infrastructure bill. A lot of the companies, like auto manufacturers who came to the US, benefited from the infrastructure bill as opposed to the IRA. That being said, they are laws. And so, not to teach a class, there's a difference between an executive order and a law. So these are laws that are still on the books. And so, and the European, you have yours. You've got your industrial deal and how you want to encourage investments into particular sectors. The current administration's sort of hostility toward green investments, I think, as I said earlier, I do think this administration has the ability to be influenced by consumers and by businesses. And in actuality, if you see who has benefited quite significantly and predominantly from both of these, both the Inflation Reduction Act as well as the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act, have been red states. And I think that certainly will influence the understanding or the appreciation of the value of those incentives and credits to further investment, to encouraging investments. But to answer your initial question, certainly there has been a slowdown because it's uncertainty, and investors don't like to go into markets where there's this kind of volatility and uncertainty.
Thank you. Well, I think that was... Ignacio, would you like to? You are in my back, so I can't really see you. Sorry, yeah.
No, I couldn't help making a little comment on this question about the Green Deal, because what I think we are seeing is quite an interesting paradox. I mean, when the United States introduced the IRA, there was a lot of concerns in Europe that this was going to be a way of attracting the investment into the US to the detriment of investment in the European Union. And the response from the Biden administration is, well, why don't you just imitate the IRA? Now, if you actually look into the Clean Industrial Deal that was published by the Commission a few weeks ago, I mean, you could argue that the European Commission had followed the advice of the Biden administration and is now introducing an industrial policy for clean tech, which is similar, not the same, but is similar to the IRA. And perhaps if there is one potential lesson to learn from this is that maybe it's not such a bad thing to invest in Europe, because Europe has a more stable regulatory environment, at least when it comes to clean tech. Some companies that have decided to invest in the United States may wonder whether they made the right decision.
Well, thank you. I kind of am reminded of one of the phrases I learned in Spain, which is paciencia es la reina de la ciencia. So patience is the queen of the science. I take this away from this panel, and thank you very much. And yeah. Thank you. That was great.
So thank you very much, all of you, for coming again. And we are moving forward to the second panel. This is a spectacular panel with top figures in this field and the security, and we will be dealing with NATO issues, the future, the present and the future of Ukraine and everything. So thank you very much.
Okay, so welcome everybody to this second panel about security. Thanks to Fundación Alternativas and thanks to the Spanish Embassy for organizing this. Let me introduce myself. My name is Cristina Olea. I'm a reporter. I'm the Washington, D.C. bureau chief for TV, Television of Spain, and I cover the White House. It's been 2 months since Donald Trump came back. It feels like decades, though. Many things are changing, and one of them is foreign policy. And to talk about this, we have here an excellent group of speakers. We have Catherine Sendak. She is the Director of Transatlantic Defense and Security at the Center for European Policy Analysis. We have here Ian Brzezinski. He served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Europe and NATO Policy, and he is a Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council. We have Corey Sheikh. She is a Senior Fellow and the Director of Foreign and Defense Policy Studies at the American Enterprise Institute. And we have Robert Wilkie. He served as Undersecretary of Defense and Secretary of Veteran Affairs, and now he serves as a co-chair of the Center for American Security at the America First Policy Institute. So I am really looking forward to hearing from you. As you know, President Trump on the campaign trail promised to end the war in Ukraine, and right now he is promoting a ceasefire. He talked to Putin yesterday, he talked to Zelensky today. What do you think about these negotiating efforts?
Well, I guess I will start, first of all, by thanking you and thanking the Embassy of Spain for the courtesy and to be on a dais with such distinguished experts. I'm a nuts and bolts military person, but I did have the privilege of serving in the presidential cabinet and watched the way things moved for 3.5 years from that perch. What struck me about the conversations with Mr. Putin was not the actual particulars of whatever blueprint they were trying to hammer out, but it was Putin's response after the phone was put on the receiver, where he launched a massive drone attack on Ukraine. Now, in my previous experience with President Trump, I can't think of anything that would anger him more or actually open the eyes of advisors more than that. When the President of the United States reaches his hand out and Putin reverts back to his KGB ways. I think, quickly, the President does have in his quiver powers that he can unleash on Putin, should he desire. And we have the experience of the first Trump administration to fall back on. We broke the Russian banking system. We flooded the world with cheaper American energy. I was signing off at the Pentagon on the rotation of combat brigades throughout the Baltics and Eastern Europe, as well as fighter squadrons. And instead of giving the Ukrainians meals ready to eat and helmets, we gave them precision-guided munitions and artillery shells. Those same powers that were unleashed in the first term should be the basis for any negotiation, further negotiation with Putin, and that is to remind him that he is actually reaching the point of strategic exhaustion. 2,000 people a day he's losing in World War I type over-the-top tactics. Just one last statistic. We lost 11,000 tanks in all of World War II. Putin's already lost 12,000 just against Ukraine. So I would hope that the President and his team remind the president of the Russian Federation who does have more cards to play. And I hope that is the outcome. I can't predict it, but I do hope that is the outcome.
So I hope Robert's right, but I fear he is not. It's certainly true that the president has those levers and abilities, but I don't see any evidence in the second Trump term that the behavior of the administration, in particular in the first couple of years
I said hope.
of the first term, that it would be a delicious historical irony if Ukraine gets saved from the Trump administration making a deal on their fate over their heads, if we get saved from that by Vladimir Putin's inability to take a good deal when it's on offer. Because what it looks to me like so far is that the president is utterly uninterested in the fate of Ukraine, and he's envisioning himself as, I don't know, Metternich or Bismarck about to make a great power deal on a range of issues, and Ukraine is the collateral damage in that. I think that's what is consistent with the president's behavior so far of penalizing our friends and emboldening our adversaries. So the president would be wise to take Robert's advice. I'm skeptical the president will.
What they said. Let me thank Vincente and the Embassy of Spain, the Embassy EU for including me on this panel. And Christine, thank you for those warm introductions. And build on Robert's point. I mean, after Trump put the phone down with Putin, after Putin, quote unquote, agreed to talk more about a ceasefire, even agreed to an agreement to cease attacks on energy infrastructure, he unleashed a barrage of ballistic missiles and drones that not only hit an energy facility, but a hospital and a school. I mean, that to me kind of gives you a sense of what is Putin's mindset. But when I think about why I'm uncomfortable with the direction that Trump is taking, I kind of sit back and think of kind of three general fact areas. One, what has been the consequence of this totally unjust and brutal invasion? And this is an 11-year war that Putin launched, that he escalated 3 years ago, and since 3 years ago, there have been over 500,000 combatant casualties on the Ukrainians, millions of Ukrainians displaced, countless civilians pushed from their homes and killed, countless atrocities, rape, summary execution, torture, committed on the full knowledge of Putin, if not his complicity in it, and a systematic attack on the infrastructure of that nation. The second factor is what's at stake for us. This is not just some distant war. This is a war on basically what was a de facto ally of the United States that supported us in Iraq, in Afghanistan, and elsewhere, a country that we had embraced as a future member of NATO. And if you're worried about the concept and principle of sovereignty, this is a case study of where it's being attacked. And a victory by Putin is not only going to embolden him to attack further in Europe, widen the war, it's going to unleash hegemons elsewhere around the world, be it in the Middle East or China. And then the third factor that concerns me about these negotiations is the unbelievable imbalance of power between the transatlantic community and Russia. I mean, think about it. Some of you have heard this ad nauseum, so forgive me.
I like it every time.
I do too.
But we're talking about an alliance that has $54 trillion in GDP. Russia's is less than 2, so we're talking about a factor of 25. We spent, perhaps ineffectively, $1.5 trillion on defense. Russia, in a fully mobilized war economy, $150 billion, a factor of 10. Why isn't it that transatlantic community, under the leadership of the United States, isn't enabling Ukraine to crush this invasion? It's a really troubling question about political will. So what we should be thinking about is not pleading for a deal, but actually, to use my colleague's point, changing the correlation of forces in the eyes of Putin, leveraging that power so it's Putin that comes to the table desperate to preserve what he's achieved, as opposed to kind of pleading for him a deal and making almost unilateral concessions. I mean, think about it. We've taken NATO membership off the table. We've signaled that we'll turn over Crimea. Just this week, we're shutting down investigations into Russian atrocities, Putin's role in launching this investigation. I'm not convinced that conceding territory and accountability is the best way to convince Putin to come to peace. In fact, it's going to cause him to harden his position in these negotiations and whet his appetite for further aggression, if not whetting the appetite for further aggression by others around the world. So I'm very uncomfortable with the direction these negotiations are going. We're not leveraging the advantages we have in the service of not only our moral values, but our strategic interests.
Yeah. Let me just follow up. Thank you so much, and thank you to the Embassy of Spain and others for having me here today. It's such a pleasure to be up here with all of these wonderful experts. I just wanted to tag on to some of Ian's comments, because this is where my head has been going in terms of how do we view this negotiation or up to negotiation or potential negotiation in a broader context. And the thing I keep coming back to is twofold. One, you want to go to any negotiating table with the strongest possible position, right? You want to be in the strongest possible position with the most amount of leverage to look across the table from your adversary and come to the best possible conclusion. I don't believe that some of the decisions that we have made in the past few weeks have teed us up for that position of strength. And I think to Robert and Ian and Corey, all of your points, how do we get there? How do we make decisions in the interim before, sitting at the table for God knows how long, hashing out details that we can come to from a position of strength? So investments, leadership, unity of effort, unity of message, unity of branding, support to Ukraine. How do we get that in the position? And I think there are a lot of opportunities, both carrots and sticks. And the stick portion of this is pretty important when you're dealing with Russia. And what that list looks like of options, I think, is critically important. The other piece of this is we have to know who's sitting across the table from us. I've been hearkening on this a lot. Any Russians who are sitting across the table from American counterparts or Ukrainian counterparts or whoever ends up sitting at the table will know everybody's bio, everybody's family history, everybody's financial circumstances, where they came from, where they worked, weak points in the US arguments, pro points in the US arguments. We need to do just as much diligence before we sit down at that table. We need to do our homework. And predominantly in history, when we deal with the Russians, we haven't always done that here in the US. We come at it from a position, I would say, of hubris, here are the Russians, we know what we're doing, we know what the West wants, and the West, we're gonna get it. And over again, terms like Russian reset, and don't they want to be part of the West? When they given the opportunity, don't they want to just become, one of us in NATO and one of us looking how we look at the world? And over again, the answer is no. So how do we approach negotiations, whatever they end up looking like, being fully aware of who's sitting across the table from us, be fully aware of their red lines and our own, and how do we do that in the most comprehensive manner? That is what tees us up for success in the long term.
May I pick up something that both Corey and Ian said, and I made this argument in the interregnum when it came to discussing the future of Ukraine, and Corey mentioned Metternich and Bismarck. I tried to throw out Corbett and Mackinder because the administration is fixed on China, and when I say Corbett and Mackinder, I'm talking about the British imperial strategy, which was simple because of the power of the Royal Navy, but they struck at the periphery. And to me, if the administration believes that China is the be-all and end-all, then I can think of nothing better than employing that old British grand strategy to weaken the two most powerful appendages of the Chinese state abroad, and that is Moscow and Tehran. Weakening those two. This is simply in America and the world's interest. Weakening those two cuts off many of the avenues for mischief that Mr. Xi would employ if he does decide to move beyond his borders. But this goes back to something that Ian's father wrote about for most of his academic career post-1965, and that is we should really start by determining whether or not America even has a grand strategy. But my argument is exactly in line here. Stopping Putin is the right thing, but it makes strategic sense if you are focused on removing China as a threat to a liberal world order that the United States has been the foundation of for many years.
If I could just build on that point, we are at a real inflection point, to use an Atlantic Council phrase. We're on the cusp of what could be an escalation into global conflict. We've got a hot war in Europe, driven by Putin. We've got rising violence in the Middle East, across the Middle East, and we've got increasing Chinese provocations and aggression in the Indo-Pacific. These are all interrelated. They're driven by the same cabal of four nations: Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran. And if we're not careful, they could escalate into a global level of conflagration with very dangerous escalatory dynamics. And if you want to prevent that, you stop it in Ukraine. You defeat Russia. You don't partner with Russia. You defeat Russia. You neutralize it. Because if Putin is defeated in Russia, he's going to become a very inward-looking person, because he's going to have a whole lot of dynamics he's going to have to worry about. And you take Russia out of the equation, that weakens Iran. To a certain degree, it weakens China, but I wouldn't exaggerate that, because you're talking about a $2 trillion economy that's kind of weak and broken anyway, versus a $17, $18 trillion economy. But you start fragmenting that coalition, and you set a precedent that demonstrates that the Western community of democracies has the will and capacity, particularly the will, to exercise its power to defend its vital interests and its moral principles.
Trump often says that there is an ocean in between. In the Oval, Zelensky told him, "You are going to feel it too." What do you think? What's at stake for the US, not only for the world and for NATO, but also for the US?
So I think America's allies should be incredibly worried about that perspective. And it wasn't something the president said once. It's his fundamental worldview that the United States has advantages other countries don't. What is so curious about the president's behavior is his insistence on reducing those advantages. I mean, the US won the geopolitical lottery by having Canada and Mexico as our next door neighbors. And I mean, if you think, compared to China, who has 13 territorial disputes, one with each of its immediate neighbors, and the United States has never had to have that worry. And so the president's factually correct that we are buffeted in the way few powers have the luxury of being. But what he is not acknowledging is the damage he's doing to those advantages. What America's alliance system has given us since 1945 is strategic depth. We get to see where problems are emerging in the world and deal with them while they are small relative to our own power and our own interests. And by abandoning Ukraine into a Russian sphere of influence, or abandoning America's NATO allies by making our security obligations called into question, we are reducing our own advantages.
Catherine.
You know, it's an interesting point, because Corey is absolutely right. We establish these foundations to have the wherewithal and the sight to hopefully not get ourselves into another world war, which is what we're all trying to avoid, again, 80 years later. It is really interesting that the same things that are categorized as advantages may become disadvantages if this policy that has been talked about is implemented, right? Which is You know, I've heard different phrases. It's now, you know, it's not about burden sharing now, it's about burden shifting. This is a recent terminology I've come to learn. What are the implications for that over the long term, not only for European security, but for US interests? I think that that's overlapping and complicated, and there's no simple answer but how we do this. Should we encourage Europeans to do more? Should we encourage those GDPs to be put to good use? 100%. When you take yourself out potentially off of the table and you remove your seat from the table, then you don't get a seat at the table. And I think that there's a connection there that needs to be made about influence versus you know, actual strategic position in the world. And hopefully those are being weighed very carefully at this point.
You know they're not being weighed.
Hope. This is the word we keep coming back to.
Well, I think that there's a silver lining for us in the events of the last 3 years. It has to be with the hope of an awakening in Europe. And this is not a new debate. All you have to do is listen to John Kennedy's first inaugural address. Ask not what America can do for you, but what you can do for yourselves and the peace of the world. And I was perusing through a January 1st, 1963 article in Foreign Affairs by Dean Acheson. This is just a few months after the Cuban Missile Crisis, where he predicted that there would be segments of the American polity who would look at the bare facts of America's predominance in military might vis-a-vis the lack of military might amongst Europeans and Canadians, and start to question why the United States Eagle is doing so much for so little in return. And let me just give you the basic facts. The combined strength of the British Army, the French Army, and the German Army is smaller than the US Army National Guard, which is the third tier of America's defense. The Royal Navy is the smallest it has been since Charles II returned from exile. And it goes without saying the weakness of the Bundeswehr. Now, this doesn't apply to our friends in Eastern Europe who live next door to the bear and have felt the jackboot and the hammer and the sickle. But if Europe, to use Ian's notes about the economic power of the European Union, but if the European Union writ large wants a seat at the table, it has to provide something more than being a banking service and engage in the hard calculations of military power. He just mentioned it. You're talking about a GDP that's 25 times larger than that of the Russian Federation. And there are those on the American right who look at a very simple aphorism, and they don't look much beyond it. 300 million Americans protecting 500 million Europeans from 140 million Russians. Now, you and I know that is a lot more complicated than those simple facts. But there has to be an awakening in Europe. I hope it is starting. But just give you one other example, just to reinforce the point with our neighbors to the north. When I was born, and I'm older than everyone up here, but I was born well after Mr. Kennedy was inaugurated. Canada had the fourth largest army in NATO. The Canadian Army now is the size of the Alabama National Guard and less effective. It used to be a three-ocean Navy. It has more icebreakers than it has warships.
And we have no icebreakers.
And we have no icebreakers, but we're going to build them in Finland, which I'm going to convey to the Finnish ambassador tonight. We need to build them in Finland and Sweden. So there needs to be a recognition, and I think it's starting to dawn on people, that this is a partnership. And once you can say definitively that that is the direction Europe is going and show the effects of that, then you have taken a bite out of the arguments that we're hearing from, I hate to say it, the Tucker Carlsons of the world. And
So I want to object. I'm sorry. I want to object to part of what Robert's saying, which is that we have had a tendency, particularly in the last 15 years, to talk down the capabilities of our allies. And to some extent, it's meritorious on size and on spending. But they're not going to fight the Alabama National Guard. They're not going to fight the American military. By comparing them to us and saying because they can't do what we can do, they can do nothing. Ukraine didn't have a major league Western European army. Ukraine had a small Soviet-oriented army that's been adapting incredibly fast with a lot of help from the United States and our European allies. We are talking our European allies into irrelevance, and it's just not true. Ukraine has fought the Russian army to a virtual standstill in the last 3 years. Poland could beat the Russian army. Finland could beat the Russian army. Denmark could probably have a pretty good swag at the Russian army. Just because Europeans couldn't win a war against us doesn't mean they couldn't win a war against Russia. They absolutely could, and we shouldn't talk down their abilities because we are persuading our closest friends that they don't have the ability to make a comeback.
well, we're not.
Let me just
The work
say
of
one thing.
SIPA has been terrific, my friend. The work of SIPA has been.
Ian, let me just
Let me just put this point in. I want to build on your point because this is Europe's hour. Here you have the United States basically driving forward in a direction that's unilaterally imposing possibly an unjust peace on Ukraine. But Europe has a voice. It has capacity. It's got 2 million men in arms. It's got $450, $500 billion in defense capability. It has to actualize that capability with what it has now. That means accelerating what Macron and Starmer are doing, which is standing up a deterrent force. I think 2 to 3 divisions is what will be needed. They can do that. Europe can do that. They can step up economic sanctions. They can actually not only help Ukraine, not only intimidate Russia, but actually push the Trump administration into the direction it should be taking by basically putting on the table that, hey, victory basically on terms that will benefit Trump is at hand. Or, in other words, make Trump look weak. Act stronger than Trump. Leverage the power it has to push Trump in a direction that he needs to go. I think if they do that, you'll actually have the United States stepping up sanctions. I think you have the United States contributing to a backstopping a deterrent force. If Europe doesn't do that, or is too slow in doing that, we're going to end up with an outcome where either Trump walks away or imposes an unjust peace on Ukraine. So Europe needs to use the power it has at hand now with speed and with decisiveness.
Well, I think I did say that this was Europe's hour. I did say that this was their opportunity to finally negate the charges that have been leveled against them. As I said, beginning with Dean Acheson, you and I were there when Bob Gates said the same thing in Munich. And I think that is our responsibility to point these things out. And you're right, you don't compare them to a peer-on-peer fight with the United States, but you have to demand of the Europeans more than they're actually doing. And you are correct that the Russian army cannot handle Ukraine right now. And it certainly couldn't handle the Poles. And I would venture to say that if the Lithuanians mobilized 240,000 troops, 48 hours, which is their plan, there's nothing the Russians can do about it.
It's a nice point.
But we are looking toward the future. And with America's attention spread, particularly into the Pacific, again, this is Europe's hour. And we've been down this road before where promises were made and they weren't kept. And I think in order to call the bluff of the isolationists and the naysayers, that Europe really has to ensure that these commitments that they are telling the world, because you just look at recent German history, which Schultz promised, and then that evaporated. So we need to demand more of the Europeans. America has to be tied to Europe. I believe that strongly. I'm in the minority in some respects in my party now. But Europe does have to step up.
Talking about NATO and about this relationship between the US and its European friends that is also changing, should European countries prepare themselves for an eventual disengagement of the US from NATO? What do you think?
Yes, I think it would be irresponsible.
No, please. I was going to say yes too.
I think it would be irresponsible of European governments not to worry that the Trump administration is a fundamentally unreliable ally. But
No. Just to tack on to this, and I think Ian and I had spoke about this, we were both at Munich last year, so of 2024. And I spoke to a lot of our foreign partners and friends about their concerns about a potential Trump second administration and what that would mean for European security architecture, what would be the way forward. Now, we were months from the election at that point, and I said, I don't know what's going to happen. But what we're asking Europeans to do and what Europeans in their hour of awakening need to do is not a 4-year problem. This is a generational problem. This is a generational set of investments that Europeans and allies and partners need to make to ensure security and stability over the long term. So whatever happens in 4 years, which, to Corey's point, I think it would be irresponsible for Europeans not to be weighing the pros and cons of all of these different scenarios that may play out. This is not something that we want decision-making based on who's at the White House. We want this decision-making based on what is needed to ensure security in the continent and in the West over the next 80 years of the NATO alliance. And I think that is the mindset that leadership really needs to have when they're talking about investments, spending a lot of money, increasing their defense spending. That is the crux of the issue. And yes, you need to be prepared, I think, at this point for any eventuality. But there's also a lot of internal work that has to get done that should be a priority.
And you have a model, France. All of the derogatory things that have been said in this country about Charles de Gaulle, who was still one of the towering figures, 20th century, and certainly was at 6'7", so he was towering. I said this to a group of French generals that one of the unknown and underappreciated stories of the Cold War was de Gaulle deciding to create an independent nuclear capability for the French. Because he foresaw exactly the things that Ian and Corey were talking about, or are talking about. And that he, in the event that an American president did decide to wash his hands of Europe, that there was enough power in the French nuclear arm to keep the Soviet Union guessing. And I do think that is something that we never give the French enough credit for, that they were a factor in the Soviet calculus for the entire Cold War. But I think I mentioned, I agree, that this is a long-term prospect that outlasts President Trump. And one other psychological note, having watched the inside of the Trump White House for 3.5 years at the cabinet table, if things begin to heat up again and negotiations start to tumble out of control, I do think that Trump will not want to be the American leader who is tagged with having lost Ukraine to Putin. That's another part of his personality that I don't think is appreciated. You can enunciate all the facts and figures and try to dissect the rhetoric, which was even hard for me sitting across at some times. But I don't think he wants to be the President of the United States who watched Russia run over a smaller country, regardless of what the thunder and lightning is with the daily statements coming out of out of the White House and the hangers-on.
You know, if I could, on this question of should Europe throw in the towel on the transatlantic relationship, I'm actually fundamentally an optimist in the long term. I mean, I think Trump is a four-year flare. It's going to be a rocky 4 years for the transatlantic relationship. But when you look at the American public, you look at members of Congress, you look even at the MAGA, the red-hatted MAGA types who back him, they're fundamentally internationalists now. Look, they're fundamentally pro-NATO, they're pro-Ukraine, and for old school Republicans, Reaganite Republicans like myself, they're more committed to defend Estonia than my little community. And believe me, I'm all about defending Estonia. So presidents have a lot of authority. They will chip away at that outlook, but you'll have only maximum 4 years to do that. In the long run, I think America will remain committed to the transatlantic community unless Europe acts in a way that exaggerates the immediacy of the threat. It overreacts, and it takes actions that shut down the transatlantic security relationship. Talk of strategic autonomy, that to me is disconcerting. That's basically giving the isolationists what they want. I heard a phrase this morning that I think really captured my mind. They talked about Europe getting strategic parity within transatlantic relationship, doing what Robert was saying, which is increasing the defense spending, leveraging their power, creating real capability. So it's a more equitable relationship as opposed to a distant or separate security entity in the transatlantic zone. So for me, the ball is actually less in Trump's court on whether or not the transatlantic community ends, but more in how Europe manages the moment. And that requires two things: leveraging its power, most urgently, in support of Ukraine to pull America in the right direction, and then two, executing those commitments on developing its defense capability. That is how you preserve the transatlantic relationship and set it up to be as successful in the long term as it's successful it's been over the last 8 decades.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
How significant do you think the U.S. declining to nominate a Supreme Allied Commander Europe would be, which is what I'd be interested in everybody on the panel's judgment on that, because it seems to me that that's the suggestion that it's not Europe driving the division, it's actually the Trump administration.
Quick answer, you're looking at me. Devastating, but not lethal. It depends on how the Europeans manage it.
I'll just add to that, and you didn't ask this question, but I will respond to it. We saw something very disturbing happen late last year. Just to give you my personal relationship, my father spent most of his career as a senior officer in the 82nd Airborne Division, which is America's most decorated combat force. And there were elements within our party who decided to take out their frustration and their angst or their feelings about the withdrawal in Afghanistan on a very fine general who commanded the 82nd Airborne Division and was dropped in to Kabul at the last minute to try to salvage a situation created not by the military but by politicians. And that's General C.T. Donahue, our 4-star in Europe. There were senators trying to destroy this man's career. That is the kind, and I'll use a phrase from earlier political battles, that is the kind of mindless cannibalism that will do nothing more than demoralize our military. It will force good people who want to join to question their desire to join. If we begin politicizing the choices that commanders make because they have been told what the objectives are by political leadership. And one of the arguments I made again in the lead up to January of this year was that the American people have already decided what they wanted to do about those responsible for Afghanistan. They voted them out of office. I was raked over the coals when I said, having served with Mark Milley and McKinsey, I knew they didn't come up with that plan. Those were politicians in the situation.
So I agree with that, but it's not just Congress that's doing that. It's the White House.
Well, no,
and the
I said
civilian
writ
leadership
large.
in
I
DOD.
said writ large. I said writ large.
I would like to open the floor for some questions and to take some questions from the audience. So, okay. I think one mic is coming. Okay, here. Okay, Federico.
Greenland, Canada, Panama Canal. So how does the overall foreign policy view is this neo-imperial perspective? Is he just putting pressure? I would love to hear your thoughts, given your knowledge of policy.
So, I mean, I wouldn't want to hazard a guess on what in the world he is doing, alienating treaty allies and neighbors that way. But I do think we need to take him seriously about it. I mean, and I think it will not have the results the president anticipates. For example, he just saved the fortunes of the Liberal Party in Canada, produced a good prime ministerial candidate from the Liberal Party who is likely to win the election, and the American national anthem's being booed by our closest friends and neighbors. Right? Like, we have a 3,500-mile unguarded border with a country that we are talking about invading. I despair at the damage that's doing to America's national security, but I do think we have to take the president seriously about it.
Yeah.
You know, my theory on this is that these territorial claims are rooted in the moment that the president took a shot to the ear, because that was a moment that he faced the fact that he's mortal, and it made him start thinking about what will be his legacy as president. And he clearly wants to put himself in the pantheon of great presidents. And great presidents, in his view, are those who've achieved territorial gains for the United States. And so when I was watching, and the reason why I believe this is because I heard the language was coming out during the transition about Greenland and Panama and such. And I thought it was a little bit more rhetorical than, and then maybe even part of political strategy to discombobulate people. But if you read his inaugural address, go down to about 2/3 of it, and he lays out the benchmarks of success for his administration, for his term. And I don't remember the words. I used to actually carry it around with me because I think it means a lot. But it's something that America's future will be defined by, he was saying his administration will be defined by, one, generating greater wealth for the United States, and then the second is territorial expansion. Blunt word, blunt phrase there. So I think he's actually dead serious about the Panama Canal, about Greenland, and about Canada. Because you don't put that phrase in there unless you're going to try and act on it. Now, what I'm not certain about is what his strategy is for that. Because pursuing those objectives will come with severe costs, which ultimately I think will curb his ability. But we would be naive to say this is just rhetoric. I think he's deadly serious about it.
Catherine, do you agree? Is this a matter of legacy?
So, before the inauguration, I had many conversations with people. It's such an unusual situation to have a gap between two terms in US politics. And so coming into a second term, my natural thought inclination was this is going to be focused on legacy. And many people who know the US system of government, meaning that a presidential term, really you have the first 2 years before the congressional elections, the midterms, to really set forward the path that you want to carry on for your legacy. At this point, it feels very much that the Trump administration is completely flooding the zone on every angle of influence, power, and decision making. It is hard for the average human to keep up. And I think that's part of the point. I take what Corey and Ian say, we're throwing around the word hope a lot. I'm hoping this is coming from almost a shock and awe perspective as you put the words out there, but really your critical takeaways are, I don't know, critical minerals or Greenland's position in the Arctic, et cetera, et cetera. Not that we didn't already have things in Greenland, and what does that look like for an expansion perspective? I don't know the minds of the administration that are talking about, retaking the Panama Canal and what that would look like, et cetera. But I do feel very strongly that the Trump administration, as they're looking at the next 4 years, believe that they are in the most prime spot they are always ever going to be in this administration right now. And we also have a Congress that isn't exuding its separate but equal branch of power. So that is all weighing in the favor of what we're seeing play out.
So let me add the psychological profile again, born of experience. I had this conversation with the chief of French military intelligence, who was very upset when Trump said, if you don't spend enough money, the Russians can have you. And I told him, you just failed your first mission as an intelligence officer. You didn't read the man's book. And if you read the man's book, it's pretty clear that his first gambit is to throw out a proposition so outrageous that it staggers the listener, and that he's all of a sudden in control of that discussion. Now, I'm from the Deep South, Can't get much farther south than New Orleans. And de Tocqueville said that we're a very different breed of American down there because we have a cultivated sense of European manners. And I've always believed that. I would never speak in those tones because I would be marshaled out of my family and inheritance. It does disturb me to talk about a friend like Denmark. Now, Harry Truman tried to buy Greenland for $100 million, so this is not a new issue for the United States. I agree with Corey. We're about to get carbon tax Carney instead of Pierre Poilievre in Canada. And if this is a gambit to lower Canadian tariffs on lumber and agriculture, okay. I'm going to give the president the benefit of the doubt, having watched him for 4 years. But it's negotiation the likes of which we've never seen before. And if it's hard for me to divine the path, I can only imagine what it is for capitals across the continent. But I think that there is a deeper mission here. I do think in the end we're going to be putting more people in Greenland to fulfill Harry Truman's goal of putting dozens of Air Force bases on that piece of land. I think the Panama Canal Treaty makes that issue a little different from the assaults on Danish sensibilities and Canadian sensibilities. But I'm pointing those things out as someone who has watched this and has seen the downstream effects of the original assault. And we'll see what happens in the next 4 years, but I will say something against interest. Ian said he didn't go the last step. Not only was the first act of the president to restore Winston Churchill's bust to the Oval Office, he replaced Franklin Roosevelt with James K. Polk. And that tells you everything you want to know right there. For those of you who are not mired in the minutiae of American history, most people think of the Louisiana Purchase as the greatest land acquisition in our history. It wasn't. It was President Polk acquiring almost the entire country west of the Mississippi in the 1840s. New Mexico, Arizona, Nevada, Wyoming, California, Oregon, Idaho, Colorado, and the list goes on.
Okay, I think we have more questions.
Just very briefly, Vicente Palacio from Fundación Alternativas. I just like to address one question for the table. Let's imagine this, if I were a European asking for advice to Americans, experts on decision makers or former officials. As you know, in Europe right now, there is a great debate on sending troops, peace troops or peace force to Ukraine. And my question here is, obviously Europe wants to take part of this deal, the Putin and Trump deal, as Ian mentioned. And I think that we should be part of the deal. My question for you is, should we trespass the red lines of Trump's administration on sending troops, for example, if this was not a plan or planned by or a part of the agreement between Putin and Trump? What are the red lines that the Europeans could or should trespass in this regard? Should we, even at the risk of provoking a rift with the U.S., even in the case we had to choose between preserving the transatlantic bond alliance and, on the other hand, guaranteeing lasting and just peace for Ukraine? What are the red lines, or what do you think the red lines of this administration regarding Europe on this? And if you think that we should trespass the red lines in a tactical manner or strategically. Thank you.
Should we go straight down the line?
Sure, I'll be very quick. I don't know what the red lines when it comes to Europe, because the administration at the beginning said the US will not be providing troops, the Europeans will have to do that. Then it turned to, well, no one's providing troops because, Putin said no European troops in Ukraine. I'm not sure what those red lines are. I think it's very clear from the administration's perspective that they have no interest in sending US troops on the ground in Ukraine, even in a peacekeeping fashion. I may be wrong, I hope I'm wrong, but you need a seat at that table too, because you all need to buy in to whatever that peacekeeping force or line of contact force looks like. But I don't think it's clear yet what those are. But Spain and Europe, all the countries in Europe, the alliance, you all need to decide within yourselves exactly what is going to ensure security and stability over the continent as well, and hopefully there's a unified message there.
I really applaud what Macron and Starmer are doing in terms of driving this effort to stand up a European deterrent force. By my math, the minimum is 3 divisions, 2 to 3 divisions, let's say 60,000 personnel, along with robust air cover, very robust air and missile defense, very robust long-range fires. That's a force that's large enough, let me put it this way, it's a force that doesn't threaten Moscow, but it's a force that could punch a hole in one of the Russian lines and jeopardize what Putin has gained, giving the Ukrainians an opening, particularly with that offensive capacity, the aircraft and on the long-range fires. That's what I would put on the table. And I would go to Trump and say, we're ready to amp up the sanctions on Putin. We're ready to get in his backyard and help support opposition to his regime. And we're putting on the table this force, and we want you to have a backup stop. We want you to back it up. And we're going to give you a bargain that you can't refuse. And the bargain is that we're going to provide 80 to 90% of this. And for the United States, you'll provide 10 to 15, probably closer to 10%. Headquarters element, long-range fires, which we already have in Europe, air and missile defense, we've already concentrated in Poland, aircraft, which we have in Europe.
And satellite cover.
Satellite cover, intelligence. Yeah. Nothing, I'm exaggerating, not a single soldier more from the continent of the United States. So, Mr. President, if you take our offer and act with it, you're going to have a success. You're going to avoid and deter a wider war. And believe me, that's the one thing that scares Trump, is being dragged into another war. I mean, he says it over and over again. This is how you prevent it. 2, you're going to be giving credibility to yourself and to your policy of national security of peace through strength, because you're going to be exercising power. 3, you're going to be doing something no U.S. president has done in the history of NATO, and that is lead the Europeans to carry their share of the burden. 80 to 90% of the effort. Not a single forward deployed troop. They're all rear echelon. Europeans in the lead. That's historic. And then, by the way, I would add, Mr. President, Right now, you're on the cusp of victory. You're about to secure this peace. But if you continue this way, where you're giving up territory on behalf of the Ukrainians and surrendering accountability to the Russians for what Putin has done, you're going to blow this opportunity. So take our deal.
I think that's really good advice. I guess if I were advising European governments, I would think there are two fundamental questions that ought to drive the policy. And the first is, are you actually willing to fight the Russians to defend Ukraine? If you are not willing to do that, I wouldn't put troops in Ukraine, because I think the likelihood that that proposition will get tested by the Russians is high enough. And the worst outcome, both for Europe and Ukraine, is having a force get shoved back by the Russians because you're not willing to defend Ukrainian territory. I think that's the worst outcome. And so often strategy is about just avoiding the worst outcomes. So first, I agree this should be done, but if I were advising a European head of state, I would want to have a high level of confidence that everybody putting troops on the ground is actually willing to have those troops defend the ground they're standing on. The second fundamental question I think I would encourage Europeans to answer is, how far do you think the United States is actually willing to uphold its end of any bargain? And I think that's very much in question at the moment. If you think the US is not going to be reliable, even with the good salesmanship Ian's outlining, then I think this is an opportunity to show the United States that it cannot dictate Europe's outcomes. And I think that's an important message to send to the US, if in fact we have switched teams in this fight. And second, it's a very important message to send to the Russians, that Europeans can do this on their own if they have to, even if it's without all the advantages that American participation would bring for Europe. I think the answer to that question should also be yes, but it's not my own security I'd be advising on.
Well, my advice is to take Ian's proposition, hand it to George Maloney and King Felipe, and have them visit the Oval Office with it. Because for President Trump, the politics is personal. The other thing I want to say is that I think all of us, in looking at Putin, are making the same mistakes that his father warned against for the entire Cold War, that we are, with all of the noise that goes on around a Trump administration, once again making the mistake of treating the Russians like 10-foot-tall supermen. And I fall back on and I used to say this about the Biden administration, because they actually believed that Putin was going to somehow consistently pull rabbits out of his hat and do things militarily that we know he's incapable of doing. And I'll give you just a quick story from the American experience. It's when my ancestors were about to lose the Civil War, and Lincoln dispatched General Grant to finish us off. But he came to an army that had been consistently defeated by Robert E. Lee and smaller numbers. And when Grant went into his first battle in the wilderness, his center caved in and Lee caved in both flanks. And his officers came to him complaining, Bobby Lee's doing this, Bobby Lee's doing that. And Grant, being the remarkable individual he was, he said, I'm tired of hearing about what Bobby Lee is going to do to us. Why don't you start thinking about what you're going to do to him? Call up some guns and fight. Now, that's not a comical observation, but I do think, and Ian and Corey, they're right, the ball is now in your court. And it's 4 years is a short time in the span of European history. But in order to do the things, and I'll just use another fact again, the Royal Artillery has enough artillery ammunition for a day and a half of a European-style fight. The Germans are worse. So these things need to be done quickly. There needs to be pen to paper. That needs to be presented on both sides of the Atlantic. And just so you know, it is not simply a European problem. I did draw up the transition plan for the Department of Defense. We have a lot of work to do over here. We have the oldest Air Force since Harry Truman created the service. We have the smallest Navy since 1936. We have a nuclear force that has not been updated in generations. I won't get into all the specifics or the math of that. So it's not just you. We need a top-down reform of our entire military establishment. Just so you know, we have an acquisition and procurement system at the Department of Defense that is the last gift of Robert Strange McNamara. It came on board before I was born, right off the assembly lines of 1950 Ford Motor Company in Detroit. We're not capable right now of meeting the exigencies of the 21st century. And I'm going to steal one of Corey's points. If we're more concerned right now about taking down pictures in the Pentagon rather than reforming the way we do the defense business, then we're in a lot more trouble than we think we are.
Okay, thank you very much. Our time is over. Thanks to you for coming. I hope you learned something today. I surely have. So, see you soon.
Thank you.
Bear with us 3 more minutes for the closing remarks by our Deputy Head of Mission, Pablo Sanz.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Antonio. Thank you to all of you. I will be brief, as Antonio said. But as we come close to the close of this seminar, I wanted to extend our sincere gratitude to Fundación Alternativas and Vicente Palacios for organizing this event alongside the Embassy of Spain. This marks their first seminar in the United States, and I am confident it will be the beginning of a valuable transatlantic dialogue. I would also like to thank our distinguished speakers and all of you for your engagement and meaningful discussions. I couldn't be here for most of the seminar, but what I could hear for the last half an hour was really interesting. I think it was a very fruitful discussion, so thank you very much. The transatlantic relationship is more than a strategic partnership. It is a profound and historic bond that has shaped the modern world. Spain has played a pivotal role in the creation of the United States and has long served as a bridge between continents. As an Atlantic nation, Spain has always viewed the ocean not as a barrier, but as a link connecting us to the Americas, to Africa, and to our European neighbors. From the very birth of the United States, Europe played a vital role in securing American independence, with Spain standing as a key ally alongside other European nations. Next year, we will have the opportunity to commemorate this achievement during the 250th anniversary of the United States independence. Today, our distinguished speakers and participants have addressed critical issues surrounding economic exchanges and security. The transatlantic economy is the most integrated in the world. Our supply chains are deeply interconnected, and our trade and investment relationships are unmatched. Spanish companies are active participants in this relationship, investing in key industries across the United States, from renewable energy to infrastructure and technology. Similarly, American businesses continue to thrive in Spain and in all the EU. Yet, we must also address emerging challenges, such as ensuring resilient supply chains chains, navigating technological competition, and reinforcing our economic security in an era of rising global uncertainty. On matters of security and defense, the Transatlantic Alliance has been the cornerstone of European and global stability for 75 years. Spain is a steadfast NATO ally, making meaningful contributions to deterrence and defense efforts from the Baltic to the Sahel. The war in Ukraine has underscored the importance of a strong and united transatlantic response, and Spain has risen to the occasion by increasing its defense investment and strategic contributions. But as the world changes at an unprecedented pace, our shared values remain the foundation of our partnership. Spain is fully committed to working alongside our American and European partners to uphold these values and help shape a future defined by cooperation, innovation, and shared progress. So thank you very much again for your participation.